Hi, friend. Welcome to this episode of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, and I am so glad that you are tuning in and taking a listen to the show today. In this episode, you're going to hear a replay from one of my favorite conversations that we have had on the show over the past 5 years. In choosing this episode, I was sure to choose one that I felt personally challenged by and that I believe will inspire and encourage you in your leadership journey. Now, it's possible you heard this episode when it first came out, but that might have been a couple years ago, and you might still benefit from taking a second listen. Or perhaps you're brand new to the show. This is the first time you're listening, and I invite you to just go ahead, tune into this episode, and then go back and find others that you feel might resonate with you and where you're at right now. Now, I want to invite you to connect with me outside of the show. If you enjoyed this conversation today and you want to connect, head over to Instagram. That's where I spend most of my time in terms of social media currently. And you can send me a DM. My username is Esther D. Littlefield. Just send me a DM. Introduce yourself. Let me know you listen to the show, and I would love to connect with you. All right, friend, let's dive in to our conversation today.
Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us.
Welcome to episode 194 of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. I'm Holly Kane, your podcast co-host, and I'm so glad that you are here with us today. Have you ever struggled with how to engage in conversations about hot topics online? How can you stay humble in your theology while still holding to the primary truths of the gospel? In today's episode, you are in for an amazing conversation about this and so much more. And we've got something a little bit different for you this time as well. Our guest on this episode is Joel Muddamalle, and he is our first official male guest besides our husbands on the podcast. We are so grateful that Joel was willing to come and share his insights with us. In this episode, you'll hear about Joel's leadership journey, including how God led him to work in a predominantly female ministry, Proverbs 31. We also discuss why we need to stay humble in our theology as leaders, how we can learn to see multiple sides of an issue, and what you should do when attempting to have conversations about theological differences. We'll also hit on the issue of deconstruction and how this relates to our need as Christians to be continually evaluating what we believe in the light of the truth of Scripture. We know you're going to love this conversation, and we can't wait to hear your feedback. But before we dive in, let me share with you the sponsor for today's episode. This episode is sponsored by Esther's mini course, Confident Conversations. This resource is designed to help you initiate and lead hard conversations as a Christian woman, even if you struggle with confrontation, aren't sure what to say, and want to avoid hurting people in the process. You can find out more and grab this mini course at confidentconversations.co. Now let's dive into our conversation with Joel Muddamalle.
Well, welcome, Joel, to our podcast. We are excited to have you here with us today as our first official male guest. So welcome.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I am so honored. And I'm going to put this on my calendar, Esther and Holly, to just, every once a year, I'll just remind myself that this was the time that I made a record. That's insane.
You're making history.
I love that. So we always like to hear a little bit about our guests before we dive into our topic. So could you start off just by telling us a little bit about yourself and what your leadership and life looks like right now?
Yeah. So my name's Joel Muddamalle, and I just last year finished a PhD in biblical theology. And so I'm a theology nerd through and through. I spent many, many years in the halls of academia and classrooms, really, in seminary and undergraduate. I'm a bit of a theological mutt. So I've kind of been in various denominations and various church spaces, and it's been really helpful for me. In terms of leadership, I started off thinking I was going to be a pastor. And so I really worked in a church as a worship person early on as a worship leader. And then I hung up my guitar. And when I realized, gosh, I really, really love theology. And so I moved more into a teaching kind of capacity. Many, many turns in my story, but I ended up church planting with Acts 29 in California. And I thought I was going to be a bivocational pastor. And so I ended up getting a master's degree in organizational psychology while I worked with adults with developmental disabilities. And probably an important note kind of along the way for me, even from childhood. I'm Indian. I grew up in an immigrant family. My grandparents are missionaries in India. Right off the bat, my mom, while she was finishing med school, sent me to India, and I was raised by my grandmother and my three aunts. We had another very close cousin who lived in the area at the time. And so I've always been around really strong, incredible, godly women in my life. And when I worked in California with adults with disabilities, my boss was the CEO was a gal. And so I look back on this now and I think, gosh, I see kind of God's hand, even in my leadership journey, where I was really blessed in vocation to always have godly women kind of around me and learning from them. Unfortunately, in my academic seminary situation, that wasn't the same. It's a really sad note, probably something I really want to see changed. And so, I ended up being asked by Lisa Turkhurst, who's my boss at Proverbs 31 Ministries, to join the team at P31 to bring oversight to theology and research. And so I've been with them for almost 6 years now. I think I have the best job in the entire world. I get to study the Bible, be in conversations about Bible studies and theology, and it's a blast. So I get to work on our first 5 app study guides that we create through the app, and then all of Lisa's book and Bible study projects. And one of our kind of fun new thing, it's a couple of years old now, but it's a project called Therapy and Theology, where myself, Jim Kress, who's a licensed counselor, and then Lise, we get to talk about various issues from a therapeutic and theological lens. And so it's been cool to see my area of, leadership even step into some of these other spaces that we never thought would be applicable, but they certainly are.
I'm going to have to check out that project that you just talked about, because I don't think that I knew about it, and it sounds so interesting. You kind of already talked about your leadership journey and the different twists and turns that you've had. But as you kind of think over your leadership journey, when do you think that you really understood that you were a leader and that it was really made clear to you that this was kind of the trajectory of your life to be in leadership?
Yeah, that's such a good question. When I think back on it, I kind of realized that my natural inclination is not to be a leader. I don't know if I'm supposed to say this on this type of podcast.
It's welcome. We have lots of unlikely leaders.
Yeah. And so it's not that I'm not a leader, like my natural inclination, and I think this is important just in leadership in general, it's not to be the CEO, the top. I've always just kind of found myself gravitated towards incredible leaders, being a support to them. And along the way, I kind of just realized, wow, people just ask questions. I would say something and they would be like, well, what does Joel think about this? This happened to me a lot in high school. And these are just kind of skill sets I think that the Lord had gifted me with. And so I'd probably see the earliest inclination of that is just sitting in silence in the odd, Bible study. It's like everybody asks a question and I just was like, I got an opinion. I'll just say whatever, here. But it wasn't my first inclination. I kind of like to enjoy sitting in the silence. And if nobody else is going to say something, I'll be like, oh yeah, I'll pop in with some thoughts. But I think we live in a culture, y'all, that really thinks that everybody needs to be the A leader, like the CEO, the whatever. And I actually heard this in a different teaching a long time ago, or a book that I read, and I can't remember it, but it's not original to me, is what I'm saying is, if you think about Facebook or Google or Amazon, all these incredible spaces, the number 2 to 10, that's pretty amazing what they're doing, that it's pretty phenomenal. And so I think it's been really encouraging for me to realize that leadership for me has not it's not meant that I had to be the person, but it does mean that I have a responsibility. And it does mean that I'm able to locate myself in that kind of organizational structure and know what my role is and what my role isn't. And so all of that first started really even in seminary classes and realizing I'm not like a lead pastor teacher guy. I realized really like early on, I'm a teaching guy. I really love teaching God's word. And again, I don't know if I'm supposed to say all this kind of stuff, but I'm not wired to like shepherd people on a day in and day out basis. I love my people and I love people in general, but a lead pastor or like, associate, like those are really important, and you got to love people and be able to like walk alongside of them. And I had to realize early on, and actually Lisa asked me this often, like, what are the things that breathe life into me? And I kind of have to be aware of those types of things in order to make sure that my leadership is moving in the direction where I think God has wired me versus fighting against the waves, and moving in a direction that is ultimately going to just wipe me out over a long period of time. It's not that I can't do it, but I probably shouldn't do it over a long period of time because it doesn't fill me up.
Yeah. That's so good, Joel. I love that you shared that. And it really aligns with our whole philosophy here on the podcast. We have this tagline of encouraging women to embrace their gifts and lead with confidence. And, that whole idea of embracing your gifts goes along with making sure you're in the role that is best designed for you. And that doesn't always mean that you're the head honcho leader in any organization. So I love that. So, we wanted to invite you onto the podcast because one of the big challenges that we see for Christian leaders is the way we handle ourselves and respond to hot button issues in culture, as well as theological differences within the Christian faith. And so I've been following you since I was introduced to you at She Speaks virtual. A couple of years ago, I attended the virtual event, I think in 2020, actually. And that's the first time I heard from you. And I was so impressed with your approach to theology. So I've been following you since then. And, really, I have been impressed with how you discuss and handle some of these conversations that can be divisive or polarizing. So that's what we're going to dive into today.
Oh,
on this
light
conversation.
Work. Nothing too serious. Thanks, guys.
So I want to start off talking about a recent Instagram post that you shared. You talked about a particularly tricky issue in the church, which is complementarian versus egalitarian. Yeah. And you talked about it in a way that I thought was both honest and humble. And so there's a quote that you said there. You said, I could be wrong on some or all of this. If I am wrong, I hope you would pray for me and ask the Holy Spirit to illuminate the text and reveal the truth of Jesus. One thing I know, division in the household of God is not the way. And in that post, you also used the term humble theology, which again, I loved that approach. So why do you think it's so vital for Christian leaders to remain humble in their theology?
Yeah, there was a 17th century astronomer, forgetting his name, Johannes Kepler, I think is his name. And he was asked once, like, how do you do theology and all this other stuff? And he was looking out into the stars one day. And he basically, the story goes, he said, well, theology is simply thinking God's thoughts after him. You're looking at the stars in the sky and you're not thinking of something brand new, but you're pondering on the existence of what's already there. And I just love that concept of theology. What is theology? What are we doing in studying scripture? We're not trying to come up with something new or something novel. We're actually recognizing that God has already thought all of these things out in advance. And it's our kind of sacred task to think those things after him. So I think instantly what that requires of us is a deep sense of awareness of our limited nature and God's limitless nature, and if we can start there, like if we can start in this, what I like to call a posture of humility, then I think the way that we do theology, the way that we do conversations, the way that we handle areas of unknown, the gray areas of the biblical text that we all wish weren't there, will actually get us to a place of deeper understanding and knowing with each other, while still leaving room for personal conviction and saying, yeah, I do have a belief here. Like, we don't have to have this syncretism that takes place and we end up with, well, there is no truth. Well, there is truth, and I think there's a way forward. And so I really think that this goes back to the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve are tempted by what? A fruit that gives them the opportunity for what? Knowledge. right? And the Holy Scriptures are what? Knowledge to us, God's wisdom for us. And I think it's very easy. I've experienced this throughout my ministry career, throughout my academic career. I've sat in PhD seminars with some of the most brilliant, I mean, y'all, and when I'm talking about brilliant, just like NT Wright level brilliance, and yet at times over the last 10, 15 years, a deep sorrow, a grieving of my own heart of realizing that the posture of the brilliance was leaning towards an area of pride, an area of weaponizing the text, weaponizing theology to kind of meet my personal agenda or to convince through manipulation or intellectual superiority that I got it all just because I can read Greek and Hebrew, And I think that those types of things are really dangerous. And at the end of the day, it creates a either I win or they win situation. And whenever it's an I win or they win, my personal belief is we all lose, instead of, hey, let me get a better understanding of your position. I want to be able to share a better understanding of my position to you. And let's figure out the places that we find commonality so that we can anchor ourselves in the place of commonality while we authentically and honestly kind of duke it out a bit in the area of disagreement. But the good news is we always find our feet on stable ground of unity, along the way. And so that's where I just think the concept of humble theology has been one that I have held on to, that I live by. I think of Jacob wrestling with God in the Old Testament, that story, and he leaves that encounter with God and he leaves with a limp. And I think it's really important that he leaves with a limp because God could have instantly healed Jacob of that limp that he gave to him. But for the rest of his life, Jacob views that limp, I believe, not as a sign of God's displeasure, but as a sign of God's presence in his life. And though he would walk with a limp that would create a sense of humility for the rest of his life, that limp was also a beautiful reminder to him of God's presence with him and that God wasn't going to leave him. And so I typically say, if you come across a theologian that doesn't walk with a limp, that's probably not a good thing. And if I start to walk around without a limp and you see me swaggering, like having a swagger or something that is unbecoming of the people of God, I usually say that is your invitation to unfollow me, and then please pray for my heart and my soul.
Oh, so many gems in there. I love this conversation because I think if you've grown up in the Christian faith for any amount of time, you have felt that weaponized theology. You felt a victim to that. And I totally agree with you on the limp. I think that's such a beautiful representation of the posture that we should be taking as we dive into theology. And we understand that people are coming at this from so many different views, and they should all be honored and they should all be given the space to have this discussion rather than shutting people down simply because it's different than what we've grown up with. And sort of on that topic, like I said, most of us have grown up in a particular denomination if you've been in Christianity for any length of time or tradition. And through that, we only learn one perspective on certain issues. Mm-hmm. So what are some practical ways that we as leaders can see multiple sides of an issue and come to these conversations humbly?
I would say I'm a great example of that. I went through my entire Bible college thinking that this was the theological position of the church universal, and unfortunately, I was not exposed in those seasons to the reality of other opinions and thoughts. The commentaries that we read, like all of those things were all part of a particular tradition, It wasn't until I started having conversations with some other people that said, hey, have you read N.T. Wright, or have you read James Dunn, or, Eugene Peterson has written some incredible stuff. And you get into like, wow, some of these guys are Anglican, some of them are Presbyterian, some of them are Baptist. Like you get into these different spaces. And I would say one of the most practical things that you and I can do that we all have access to today is books, a library. And I always think of, and I've got like behind me, I've got so many different books. Here's a great one from Andrew Murray on humility. And, Murray was alive in a time that none of us were alive. And yet I can sit down with my cup of coffee and Andrew Murray and have a conversation with him, and he's speaking to me through the words that he penned, and I'm speaking back to him as I'm thinking about it. And he comes from a different tradition that I do. He views the text in a different way. And so I would suggest absolutely finding that. Now, there's a couple series, and I'm looking at my library for them. I think it's Zondervan has a series called Counterpoints, and it's super helpful because what they've done is they've taken kind of like the top well-known scholars of every position, like you guys mentioned, the egalitarian, complementarian, that was the entry point into this. And they have a great book that my doctoral advisor's dad, Dr. Tom Schreiner, was a part of that Counterpoint series. And he comes from a complementarian position, but he's engaging with top scholars that are egalitarians. And we get this incredible honor to have this book in front of us that has the positions of these incredibly brilliant scholars that are both arguing their positions, but we could get to engage, we get to read and we get to learn from. And I can say, yeah, Tom, I disagree here. Or yeah, Bloomberg, I disagree here. But actually, you both are agreeing here, and we find that commonality. So I really do think books are just an incredible opportunity. We're on a podcast, so podcasts are always great. I have a bit, again, I don't know, I'm supposed to say any of this stuff, guys. So, I have had a bit of a love kind of hate relationship with podcasts. I'm a really big believer in active learning. And so I kind of have a role and a place for podcasts in my life. And it's like in the sauna after I work out, or some place where I want to I can't do anything else. And I'm going to meditate and think on some different thoughts. So I think even combining reading, which is active learning, you're taking notes and having to think through it. And then a podcast, which is passive learning. And I think Preston Sprinkle's podcast, Theology in the Raw, Preston is brilliant. And he will consistently bring on people that have very different opinions than he might, but he engages in a way that helps us to see both sides. So I just think that we live in a day and age where we have more access to a diversity of opinion than ever before. It just takes a little bit of, searching to find those places. But books and podcasts, I think, are so easily accessible for us. And those are two very practical places. You can go to the Counterpoints series that has everything from atonement to hell to heaven, all this stuff, to Preston's podcast, Theology in the Raw, which I think is super helpful.
I love this conversation because, I've always thought if you are reading books that don't challenge you, that you don't disagree with, then you're just reading cheerleaders who are helping you get entrenched into your own thoughts. And how do we come to the place of knowing truly what we believe if we don't challenge those things, if we don't sort of go head to head and duke it out with our own opinions and our own convictions? And so I just love that because, as you said, it's an active way of learning and it's an active posture to take, that we're always working on what we believe and why those convictions live in our mind and in our heart. So I just wanted to say I'm super happy that you said that, because it so underscores what we believe here on this podcast and sort of duking it out with other people and in a really healthy and loving way. So yeah.
I think that's really good. And let me do a little. So this is the academic theologian in me. I'm always nuancing all of my positions, so consider this the footnote in this conversation. And here's my footnote. My footnote is, man, don't discredit or throw away the tradition that you came from, right? There's beauty there. There's importance there. It frames us in some ways, but here's what I think is really important, that you're aware that it is a position and a way to frame it. And that little a versus the is super important, because we flip and slip into the way, which becomes now a position of superiority. If you don't believe the way that I think of what baptism is, then everybody else is wrong and I'm right, versus recognizing. And this, Esther, is to your point, why I talk about complementarian and egalitarianism is over the last decade, I have grown and I've learned and I've read, and I have seen some gray areas where I refuse to allow people to pin me down as one thing, because I'm the text just doesn't, Paul wasn't thinking complementarian and egalitarian when he was writing in Ephesians and in these places in Timothy, right? These are new novel terms that have come up that are trying to help us figure out a framework, but it's a framework, not the framework. And the other thing that I would just want to tag on is, I'm reading this book by Eugene Peterson. It's called Letters to a Young Pastor. And it's really brilliant. It's basically him writing to his son who came into ministry, and he unpacks some of this stuff. But personally, one of the things that I try to do, I'm researching right now deep in marriage. What does the Bible say about marriage, about divorce, about all of these types of things, separation? I'm deep in research on it. And I got a question on my Instagram like, well, Joel, what do you think? And I go, well, I have a leaning right now. But one of the things that I try to do when I approach a new project is like literally I will write down, here's my preconceived presupposition position. And it's not like without lack of fact, like I studied this thing, I was taught these things, and I write them all down. And then I do like the symbolic act. I take it and I put it in the corner of my office, right? And I'm walking away from it, not like rejecting it or burning it. I'm just walking away from it and recognizing now I am unaware of many, many positions versus cultural context that I need to help inform and reinform this position that I had. And so I told them, like, I can't give you what you're looking for right now because I'm still in the research phase. Like I'm reading books from people that are literally fighting against each other on this position. And then I have to come to a conclusion, at the end of the day. And every time, y'all, I'm telling you this, every time I get to the end of one of these projects, I come away, and I believe we all should come away, if we're doing it the right way, with a deeper sense of gratitude for the position I disagree with. It is much more difficult for me to be antagonistic and kind of, like throw bombs across after I've done my work of reading it. Cause I go, wow, this is a good, this is a good point. Like this one by itself might disarm my entire thing. Now, at the end of the day, I think you're wrong. And I think I'm right on this thing, but you know what? It is much more difficult for me. And it frames the way that I communicate about the other position, which I think is really important.
Oh my goodness, I could talk about this all day long because this is exactly the kind of stuff that I think is so important for us as Christians, not just leaders, but Christians in general, to learn how to do this and do this well. And, just backing up to what Holly was talking about with growing up a certain way. And so I grew up in a particular theological denomination, and then I went to a Christian college where I was introduced to all kinds of other Christians who went to different churches and had very different views from me. And that was really the first place where I had to kind of wrestle with not just like my faith as a whole, but wrestle with my actual positions on certain topics. And, again, one of the things that I've seen you talk about is this idea of painting with broad brushstrokes and making assumptions, and how when we do that about somebody that has a different position, it shuts down dialogue. So I'd love to hear your take. How do conversations and dialogue about our differences play a role in biblical unity?
Yeah, I have a coworker at the ministry, a dear friend. She's on the executive team at Proverbs. Her name's Lisa Allen. And one of the things I learned from Lisa Allen is she always, whenever we go into a conversation and she's unaware or unsure, she always leads with, well, help me understand. And I think that framing a discussion like this, starting with, well, help me understand, I think what it does is it opens doors for honest conversation, but it makes a demand on you as an individual. It demands for you to sit receptively and to hear some things that you might not want to hear and you want to fight against and say, well, but this, but that. But you have to bite your tongue and hold yourself back because it's vitally important that we as an individuals, right, that we understand the other position. I would argue we should be able to understand and defend the other position better than they could. Right. And so one of the things that I do when I'm writing about something that I am disagreeing with, I had this happen the other day where, I'm not a dispensationalist theologically. Like there's this whole dispensational theology. I've got a very good friend of mine who we went through our PhD seminars together, and he's a professor at a great seminary, and they're, more of a dispensational school. And I was writing something where I basically was saying, hey, I disagree with this position. Now I sent that to him. And I said, hey, I need you to look at this. Did I fairly present your position? And he read, he goes, oh yeah, Joel, this was good. In fact, this was even better than, in some ways. And then he gave me some critique like, hey, I would use this verse instead of this. I think that's super important. I think we have to be able to start in that place. And so here's what happens when you do that. It's, again, very difficult for you to paint large brushstrokes. It's part of what's hard for me on podcasts and teaching things that's like 15 minutes or 20 minutes, because my tendency is not to do large brushstrokes. Sometimes we're forced into it, but I'll say a disclaiming statement and there's a lot of nuance to this and a lot of questions that we need to think about. But in general, this is what I'm saying. And that's a way that you can get around that. And notice the difference is I'm dealing with generalities to help us get into a place of conversation versus painting a large brushstroke to stop the other person from dialoguing with me. And that, I think, is vital. And the other horror and kind of challenge of the large brushstrokes is people feel that you're talking at them, not to them, which is never good. People feel like even if they were to say something back, that you're not going to listen because you painted such a large brushstroke. Like, they don't care about nuance. And so I think our care in the conversation is really important. And I really do think it starts with that place of, can you adequately, honestly communicate the other position to the point of you can. Tom Schreiner did this the other day in an interview. They asked a question and he goes, the strongest opinion on the opposite side that is hard for me to respond. He went into it. And I was like, Tom didn't have to think about that. He knew right away the argument that he'd be like, that kind of dismantles a bunch. That's one that I got to kind of take in the chin, I got to figure that one out. And I think we've got to be able to do that. So that's a great practical example. If you're walking into a conversation and you're going to paint a large brushstroke, my question for you would be, can you even, without researching, right? Can you point out the opposite position's strongest point? And if you can't, it might be a good place for you to pause before you post or react or comment or whatever it is that you're going to do, and go into conversation or research and study so that you can figure that out.
Yeah. And so much of this goes back to where we started this conversation with the issue of humility, right? And going into those conversations, being willing to say, I could be wrong, or I'm holding my position with an open hand, or at the very least, I'm here to listen and hear what someone else has to say rather than just try to prove my point. And I think that's so important. I love studying apologetics, and a huge lesson that I've learned from studying apologetics is what you just said, the importance of being able to defend your faith. But the way you defend your faith is by being able to understand someone else's perspective on why they would think Christianity is wrong. Exactly. And you can't defend Christianity without understanding where other people have issues with Christianity. So the same thing goes in these conversations about differences on theological issues. We've got to be willing to understand the other person's perspective before we try to just come in and claim our stake in the ground on what we think.
Yeah,
it's true.
So good.
Yeah. So a follow-up to that is, I think a challenge for a lot of people is there's a fear when it comes to having some conversations around theological differences, in particular, that there's certain topics that can come up that start to lead into what some might call progressive Christianity, or straying away from traditional Orthodox Christian faith. And so it's almost like if I start to open up the conversation about differences, then that's just going to lead me down the path of totally having lost my faith or agreeing with someone else because I'm listening to them. So I don't know if this question makes sense, but I guess I'm curious where you stand on having conversations with people maybe that aren't holding to what someone might say is Orthodox Christianity, or, the holding on to the primary truths of the faith, and how we navigate that without being fearful.
Yeah, I heard this again before. So again, not a new thought, original thought of mine, but there are things in culture, and I think I would argue in conversation as well. There are things that we need to receive, things that should be redeemed, and things that should be rejected. And so in this conversation, I'd say, okay, and I think again, it's important that we also have a good awareness of ourselves and where our spiritual maturity is. If you are a brand new believer and you're just getting, like, I think it's super in Galatians, Paul, I mean, he's converted and then he spends 3.5 years like in Arabia, basically, right? Like, I think that's where he went. He bounces. And why? He's studying God's word. He had spent a lifetime as a devout Jew, a Pharisee of the Pharisees. And then he realized on the road to Damascus that everything that he thought to be true of the Messiah was wrong in a sense, right? He missed Jesus. And so he's like, I got to do some work. And so he goes 3 years. And then the first thing he does after it, he says it in Galatians, I go to Peter first and spend some days with him and learn. And so I think that is such a good principle for us to remember, that there is a time and space and season for us to engage in different types of conversations and types of content. So for example, it might not be the wisest thing for a brand new Christian to step into a debate with a Muslim or a Jehovah's Witness or, something, because you just may not have the maturity, the knowledge, right? Like, that's kind of putting somebody in an unfair position. And it's important that you get grounded first so that, and this is what Paul talks about. It's like, hey, I think it was Paul, maybe it was Peter, that we should test the spirits, right? Like, not everything that comes to us that is supposedly godly wisdom might not be wisdom. The enemy himself disguises himself in light, and that's part of the strategy that's present there. And so I think one is this caveat of just know yourself, know whether or not it's wise or not. The other example is a alcoholic, and the alcoholic is like recovering and doing an incredible job, 10 years sober, and all of a sudden they go, you know what? I'm going to open up a new business. I think I'm going to open up a bar. Like, nah, probably not a good idea, right? Like the just common wisdom says not a good idea. So that's the start. Now, I think there's a lot of people that need to step up and step into conversations they've spent far too long avoiding, because like what Paul said, like, it's time for us to move from, milk to substance. And so in that sense, absolutely. There are theologians that I read and philosophers that I'm reading that I would be like, I definitely do not subscribe to all of their positions on A, B, C, and D, but they've got one position here that I think is really, really important that we understand. And this is that thing that we can redeem, right? I'm rejecting A through Z, but B, I think we need to stop and we need to redeem B. And just because I'm redeeming B, and this is called a logical fallacy that I see our society doing, just because B is something that I can say that's redemptive and we should value, the assumption from others at times is that I am now co-signing A through Z. And that is not true. And I think so that it's dual. It's the responsibility of the person to communicate clearly, but it's also the responsibility of the people to have a posture of generosity and understanding and just not make illogical conclusions. Like, we wouldn't ever, just because I say Michael Jordan is the greatest of all time does not mean that LeBron James is a horrible basketball player. And often in that discussion and in that argument, that's what people hear. And it's not true. I'm just saying LeBron's not as good as MJ. He's better than 99% of everybody else. He's just not as good as MJ, right? And so I think those are the types of things that in a culture that we have more information and quicker access to information than ever before, my fear is we're actually becoming less logical. And I hate to say it this harshly, but we're kind of becoming dumber along the way. Our ability to critically think and to give the benefit of the doubt and understanding is totally lost. And in mediums like social media, Instagram and Twitter, Lord help us, right? Like, I could literally be answering, happened to me recently. I literally am answering a specific question. And then somebody's like, well, how about, and goes into and like dunks on me. And I'm like, I was never part of the question that I asked, Another simple thing, just because I follow people on Instagram doesn't mean that I promote all the things that they're doing. There are people that I follow on Instagram that I 100% disagree with everything. And yet I, as an academic and as a student of the culture, I need to be aware of what people are saying, what the culture at large is grasping onto. Paul in Acts chapter 17, in the Areopagus, he quotes two pagan philosophers, right? Well-known philosophers that everyone like, oh yeah, absolutely, I know. So Paul had this understanding, even himself, of being able to receive the things that we should receive, redeem the things that are kind of there but need the gospel, and reject things that are just not good, that are just antithetical to the gospel.
Yeah, we have a concept that we talk about often on our podcast where we call it chew and spit. And that's kind of gross, but we need to be chewing on all of this and spitting out the things that we are to be rejecting when compared with truth. I will say from a different perspective on this, Joel, that may be the first basketball reference we've had on this podcast. And I'm here for it all day long.
Well, I broke a second record. There you go. Look at
amazing.
me.
It's amazing.
All in one day.
I'm concerned that this younger generation even knows who Michael Jordan is. So that's really where my concern comes from that. But
listen, I sit my boys down. They can't stand it. I sit them down every time. I'm like, well, Steph Curry. And I'm like, sit down. And I will put on YouTube highlight reels of MJ. And I just love it. I would love watching their jaws drop. And they're like, Dad, that's a foul. I'm like, bro, it was a different NBA back in the day. Like, no, Steph is not going to the paint the way that he is today from back then, you know? And so, but hey, you bring up another really good thing, another good point. We have really short memories. Yeah. You know, our theology of remembrance is not great. And so one of the things is like the further away that we get from these anchors of truth and context, the more important it is for us to be good students of that culture and of that time. I'm watching, and I mean, we're kind of going in a different tangent right now, but as leaders, I think we've got to be aware of the generation and context and culture that different people are growing up at different times. When I'm preaching and teaching today, I can say a reference like 9/11, right? And I know in an audience that's going to mean so many different things for so many people. Yes. My kids today only understand 9/11 from the context of a textbook, which makes me feel incredibly old in one sense, right? Because I'm like, no, like I remember sitting in a classroom watching the second plane hit the tower. And so this, I think, is another aspect. We use the MJ analogy, and whatever is in front of us, we end up thinking is the thing, right? It is the truth. It captures all of our attention. And yet, as leaders, we've got to be, I think, great historians. Like we've got to be able to bring back and show, oh no, y'all, the Bible and the text and leadership principles, these are all things that Jesus himself has modeled. And even the law in the Old Testament, these are all principles that the law intended for the hearts of humanity to be kind of going after. And so I love what you said there, because I do think that history, you know, like that fear, like, are people even going to know MJ? I'm like, let me know. I'm going to let you know right now. Michael Jordan, GOAT means greatest of all time. And he is number one. There's no, if there is a number two, it's Kobe as a 1B, because he literally copied, he said it in interviews. He copied every move that Jordan had. And then LeBron is, you know, number two. And we talked, two is a great place to be, y'all.
Yes, we did. We did.
A great place to be.
So we're just making sure that everybody understands that the issue of who was the greatest of all time in basketball is not a primary versus secondary issue. It's definitely a primary issue for Joel.
If you're in close friendship with me, right? Yes, it becomes not a secondary, but an essential. No, I'm joking. Kind of.
I just love that you took basketball and just had so many like theological aspects and perspectives that you could just pull out of there. That is the sign of a true thinker in my mind, because you can really just relate it to so many tangible things. I think, and this actually segues into my next question, but I think something that's so important to kind of tease out of what you just said is like, every generation thinks that they have the best and that they found the key to life and happiness and purpose. And there is a discouragement to look to the past, because the people in the past could not be as smart or as enlightened as we are. And yet there is a very rich history of thinkers and theologians and philosophers that we need to go back and go, hey, like Ecclesiastes said, there's nothing new under the sun. We have not come up with anything new. Yeah. And so all of these things that we think we've discovered, there's traces and evidences of it in history. We may take a different perspective. We may add a modern flair to it, but it's not new. In that sort of line, there's a growing movement of people that are discussing the issue of deconstruction. This is not new in Christianity. However, we are talking about it afresh. And so there's a lot of conversation around Christians moving towards progressive Christianity. And now it seems like the word deconstruction has become taboo, and it's something to be afraid of. And so I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts on the term deconstruction. So shouldn't this be something that we're always doing in our faith to make sure that it's built on truth? And where's the line between it being healthy and dangerous?
Yeah, this is a 3-hour podcast, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Absolutely.
There's a couple things here, and I want to be honest. There's a philosophical, technical conversation that's happening here that I'm going to be very honest, and I'm going to show my humility here. I'm not well-versed enough to discuss or dialogue or to even give you the roots of it all. But I will say there are primary resources out there that if you really want to get into it, those are the places that we want to think through. Here's what I'm observing, and I want to make a larger observation. Because we have so much access to information, we can take phrases and thoughts and concepts out of its original context and place it in a brand new context, and then create an entire definition, an entire world, an entire concept around it. And that's actually a disservice, because what we've done is we've not been, I think, genuous. I don't think we've been authentic and kind to the roots of that conversation. And then we try to apply a whole new set of rules and restrictions and ethics upon that discussion that it was never in the first place intended to have, right? It's like taking a lion out of the whatever, and putting it in the middle of an ocean, and then being mad at the lion for not surviving in the ocean. The lion was never designed to survive in that, right? Okay, deconstruction. I think it's interesting that in Paul's language in the New Testament, he talks a lot about putting on the clothes of righteousness and putting off your old clothes. He says, put on the new self, the new humanity in Christ. Put off the old self, the old humanity, and don't pick it up again. I think Paul's language is the first indication that we have of the type of deconstruction that we as Christians should be doing. So it's going to be twofold. One is there's a type of deconstruction that says, I am in the process of sanctification. I'm in the process of becoming the new creation. And part of the new creation is recognizing the parts of me that are still stained with sin, that are still fallen, that are still depraved, and saying, I've got to put those things off. The more the Holy Spirit makes me aware of it, and put on the new identity that we have in Christ. This, to me, is a biblical definition of deconstructing. You're deconstructing the old self, which is an imperative of the gospel, and you're reconstructing, you're putting on the new self, which is an imperative of the gospel. This is also Paul's language in Ephesians chapter 2, when he uses the architectural metaphor of the temple and how the people of God are the building blocks and how they all come together and grow into. The Greek tense here, it's an action that started that continues on in time, right? It's an ongoing reality. And then there's another aspect to deconstruction that I think it's important that we recognize. I'm going to put my youth pastor hat on from many years ago on this one. I've been having a lot of conversations with youth pastors recently, and even in I think this is an important aspect for leadership as well, that there has become this thought that if we can do the gimmicks and if we can create the environment and we can do the Justin Bieber-esque concert feel and give a hype message, that we will grow our ministries. And I think even in our leadership, if we could just do the new cool fad, if we can do the Instagram reels, and if we can do this, and that, whatever the culture is telling us is going to be your path to growth, if we can do I call them gimmicks, if we can do the gimmicks, that it will create growth. Now, here's the thing. I do think it will create growth. What I'm worried about is the substance of that growth. Is it sustainable over a long period of time? And there's a season of my youth ministry career where I was super into the gimmicks, all-nighter. And I'm not saying that those things are bad, but it was to an unbalanced level where that generation of students went into Philosophy 101. They read Nietzsche for the first time and they said, God is dead. And there was no theological background that they could even pull on. And they were in a crisis of faith, right? And so I think that there is an imperative that we have as leaders to expect and to give sound theology, sound doctrine, sound leadership in the expectation that there is going to be a world that is going to cause them to question and to think, right? And so that's one aspect of it. And there's another aspect of it. The more you grow, and we've already discussed this in passing here, I would say over the last 10 years, there has been a type of deconstructing of my understanding of women in leadership in the complementarian and egalitarian position that has required of me to reconstruct based upon new information, new convictions, growth that I've had, experiences that I've had. That's not a bad thing. That is a natural part of human growth. And like the parent I am today, 12 years into marriage, is totally different than who Joel was when we had Liam, who's 10 now, 10 years ago. Like, and that's a good thing. I learned a lot, And so I think that we have to be aware of all of those different levels and nuances of what deconstruction is and what it is. And here's what's happening, I think, for a modern culture. And this is kind of the taboo area of it. The thought is everybody has lied to me. My pastor has lied to me. The theology I read has lied. All this is a lie. And because it's a lie, I have to deconstruct everything. And I'm turning not to the scriptures or not to what I believe to be true, or what, is truth. I'm turning to what the world is telling me is true. I'm turning to New Ageism. I'm turning to human philosophy systems and all of that. And so now I've deconstructed what I've believed has been a flat out lie to me, and I'm reconstructing. The problem is you're reconstructing another fabricated house. And it's going to fall apart in a matter of time. Every social justice movement that we've ever had that's not rooted in the gospel has fallen apart over a period of time. It's a fad for a moment, but unless it's the heart of the gospel and the people of God come around it and actually do it, because that's an imperative of the people of God, it's going to fall apart. And that's what we're seeing as well with deconstruction, I think.
Yeah, Joel, this is such a good conversation. And I think you mentioned this term earlier, and it's the term that I keep coming back to whenever I go on social media, is the need for critical thinking. And what we need to be able to do when we talk about deconstruction is we need to think critically, and we need to define, when someone uses that term, what are they meaning by it? It goes back to what you said earlier, like trying to understand that person's perspective on it. But even as a mom of a teenager now, I have my concerns about what she's going to believe when she's 25. Yeah. And so we have a lot of conversations where I don't just tell her what to think, where I force her to figure out what does she think about that issue? Or we ask, I ask questions. And I think sometimes in the church, we are so afraid of someone doubting or someone going down that road of deconstruction or even deconversion that we don't allow space for the questions and the critical thinking that is needed for someone to actually be able to hold strong when they're faced with those challenges.
Yeah, here's just another side. I mean, I'm dealing with this with my kids, and it goes back to the humility kind of discussion from the beginning. I think for far too long, I've thought that any sign of weakness or any sign of doubt is going to dismantle and derail my faith and the faith of the people that trust me, that I'm leading, and the faith of my children. And what I'm actually finding is that's the absolute opposite. It's that fabricated confidence that's actually going to be really horrible for people when they're met with, wait a minute, there's a lot of different opinions about this. And so on Tuesdays, I do this thing on my Instagram called Theology Talk Tuesday. And for the first time this week, I had parents literally say, question for my kid. And I'm like, really, these are hard things. Like, if God loves everybody, then how come he won't give Satan a second chance? You're like, whoa, okay, there's a whole discussion in that, and they're asking really difficult things. My middle son, Levi, is a brilliant mind, and he's asking a lot of questions about faith. I am often tempted to give what I think is just an answer just to get him to stop talking and to give him a false sense of confidence. Really what I'm doing more of, and I think we should all be okay with doing earlier than later, is saying, son, I don't know. I really don't know. I think this is a really good question. Let's figure this out together. Let's study together. Let's pray about it together. And I think if we can start that earlier on with the people that we're leading and the people that are placed into our lives, like our children, the easier it's going to be for them when they experience it themselves, because they'll go, oh, I've experienced this before, like with mom and dad. They didn't know and I didn't know, and we just figured it out together, right? Versus them coming to that conclusion or that understanding and going, well, mom and dad, did they lie to me this whole time? Because they acted like they knew it all. And clearly this is, and they come back to you like, yeah, I don't know. And they're like, wait a minute, what do you mean you don't know? And so I think that all of that is kind of important to keep in mind. And again, our posture before the Lord, our awareness of our finite reality and God's infinite nature. It's that humility that makes, I think, all this possible.
I love that we're closing down to an end at this point, because I think that helping our kids learn to ask the right questions and learn to engage with topics rather than just lazily looking for the conclusion, I think is so important, because we'll raise those leaders who are not afraid to engage with hard questions. Yeah. I think for me, as someone who was growing up in the time that I did, we were given the answers that we were supposed to think.
That's right.
And so when it came time for me to engage with those questions, it was scary. It was really hard. And I was like, oh my gosh, am I not a Christian anymore because I'm having this thought or this doubt or this question? And so the best way we can arm our kids is to help them engage. And I love that we're talking about this. So I will say, though, as you were talking about it, I immediately thought of my son, and he gets so frustrated when I say, I don't know. He's like, but I just want the answer. And I'm like, I don't know, man. Yeah. And I think it's a great place, like you said, of humility to come to it and say, hey, I'm this old. I won't put in the age I actually am. I'm this old and I still don't know the answer to that question. And that's okay. Yeah. It's okay for me to sit in the unknowing for a while. I can't sit there forever. I need to engage, but I'm okay with the fact that I don't know right now.
Yeah. I mean, I was not good at math at all growing up. And I know, like, if you guys saw me, you're Indian. Indians supposed to be really good at math. It skipped a generation or something, because all of my kids are like in AP. They're doing all this math and they're like, I'm like, go to your mom for help. I can't figure any of this out, But I do remember at one point in time in school that you could get to the right answer, right? Like the teacher wanted you to show how you got to the answer, because it was possible for you to get a right answer, but to get there the wrong way.
Yeah.
And so then you have the next one and you do the exact same process, but you get the wrong answer, And I think what you brought up is a really good point, is why is that we're like, just give me the answer. Well, because we've bought into a system. I think it's part of it is innate in us. Like we just want the answer so we can know what to do. But the challenge is that we've got to know how we got there so that we know what to keep doing in the future. And I think the story of Israel wandering in the wilderness for 40 years is more about them learning how to be the people of God, so that when they get into the promised land, when they get into Canaan and they get to what they wanted, they know what type of people they were supposed to be,
That's so good. So good. We could talk to you forever, I think, but we all have lives and other things to get to. So we should probably wrap up. And I just want to thank you so much for having this conversation with us and being super honest and super humble. We always end by asking the same question to everyone that we talk to, because we here on the podcast believe that leaders are learners, and our guests usually have resources to share. And I've been so happy. I've been like writing down some of the things that you've been sharing already, but I'm wondering if there's a book or a podcast or another resource that you've been learning from lately that you could share with our audience that they might enjoy.
One of the things that I've been doing recently is trying to always have an autobiography in my rotation of reading lists. And I'll give you the two or three maybe that have been the most significant for me this year. One is Eugene Peterson's biography. I think it's called A Burning in My Bones. You guys might need to fact check me on some of these titles, but that one just changed my life, honestly, in many ways. Eugene, one of the great regrets I have is not being able to meet him in person. He is the epitome of pastor, scholar, theologian for me. And his life is the mark of a humble scholar, humble pastor. The second one is called Strange Glory. I'm looking for it in my bookshelf. I think it's called Strange Glory, and it's Dietrich Bonhoeffer's biography. I think Charles Marsh wrote that, and that one was phenomenal. And then the third one, this is for those of you that are more theology nerds, technical nerds. It's called A Critical Biography of the old theologian called Herman Bavinck. That's also a really good one. So those three kind of books are my go-to autobiographies or biographies that I think are incredible. And then just in terms of podcasts that I always am learning from, I'm a huge fan of the Bible Project. I think Mackie and the crew there are just brilliant. I'm so thankful for what they do in ministry. And then also I mentioned Preston Sprinkle and Theology in the Raw, I think is an incredible place that I go to personally when I'm like, I don't know, how do I figure this out?
Awesome. Thank you, Joel, for those recommendations. We'll make sure that those are in the show notes and we'll double check the titles. So
double check the titles. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, just to echo what Holly said, thank you for taking the time to be here with us and share your insights. As we wrap up, I know that the gals listening are going to want to connect with you, follow you. So what's the best place for someone to connect with you and learn more from you?
Yeah. So my Instagram is just my last name @Muddamalle. And I do the majority of my teaching and connecting kind of there. My website is the exact same thing, muddamalle.com. And I have a thing called Bite-Sized Theology, where every month you'll get an email where I just kind of walk through a theological concept in 5 minutes or less. And so I think it's an easy kind of accessible way for y'all to continue to grow in your theology, but not in a daunting way. So those two places, my website and then Instagram.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you again. Thank you for being our first official male guest. We'll celebrate this moving forward.
Amazing.
And we appreciate your time being on the podcast today.
So I just need you to make sure that whoever the second male guest is, that you just remind them they're number 2. And this was my number 1 moment. So there we go.
Love it. Awesome.
All right.
Thank you.
Hi, friend. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. We're so glad you took the time out of your day to listen, and I truly hope that it made an impact on your ability to lead well. If it did, would you consider sharing this episode with a friend? You could take a screenshot of the episode and share it on your social media, maybe an Instagram story or on Facebook, or you could just text the link to a friend. We would truly appreciate that, as when you share with a friend, it helps spread the word about the podcast, and it helps more women to be able to be impacted so that they can lead and love others well. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.